Before we start this video, a large thank you to Guilherme, Evan, Hunter, Rode, and Justin for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And a special thank you to Halo Burner for their immense support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, my friend. I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, and today we're going to add stamina drain and damage to our weapons, and we're going to open a damage collider and deal some damage to whatever we're hitting. So, if you go to the play target attack animation, you can see here I made some comments. We need to keep track of the attack type when we're actually attacking. We don't have a way to do that right now, so let's go to our enums and let's make a new public enum called attack type. Now what is this going to do? Basically, it's going to notify our combat manager of which attack type we're currently using. Think of like light attack 01 or 02 or running light attack, etc., because each specific attack type has different modifiers we're going to apply. So let's make one for now. We're going to call it light attack 01 because that's all we have. And let's go to our play target attack action animation and let's add a required field for an attack type. Now we don't need to pass this on the server RPC for the play target attack animation because only the local player needs this information. Because we're handling our stamina and stats locally, other people don't need to know how much stamina we're losing per attack. So let's go to the weapon item scripts and let's go to our weapon modifiers, the stamina costs here, and let's make a modifier for the light attack stamina. So we're going to say public float light attack stamina modifier. What this is going to do is going to take the base stamina, and based on the attack type of light attack, it's going to modify how much we lose. So, for example, a heavy attack will require more stamina than a light attack. So we have the base stamina cost, and we change that based on these multipliers. So I got mine called light attack stamina cost multiplier. I'll make it 1, or honestly, since it's the regular attack, we can just keep it 1 for now. Now let's do the same thing for the damage modifier. So I'm going to make a float for the light attack 01 damage modifier. Now, why am I making one for light attack 01? Well, in Dark Souls 3, and I believe Elden Ring as well, the different light attacks in a combo chain have different modifiers. So, for example, the second attack in Dark Souls 3 deals more damage than the first with most weapons, if not all. So I'm going to make a header here and call this attack modifiers, and I'm going to make the first one again 1, and I'm going to change the header here to stamina cost modifiers. And actually, just so we can actually see it for sure, I'm not going to keep it 1. I'll make the damage modifier 1.1 and the stamina modifier 0.9, just so we know it's actually changing and working for the purposes of the video. So I'm going to save that. That looks good. I'm going to go over now. We're going to get an error. If we go to perform light attack, what we want to do is now pass an attack type. Since this is a light attack and it is light attack 01, I'm just going to say attack type dot light attack 01. And we can save that and we should be good to go. All right, let's minimize that and jump back over to the player combat manager. Now let's make our functionality to drain some stamina based on our attack. So I'm going to make a public void, drain stamina based on attack. And this is quite simple. We just need to do a few checks. Now this is going to be ran on an animation event, which means it will be ran by everybody. So we need to check for the owner. And if we're not the owner of this object that's running it, return, don't do anything, because we're attempting to modify a network variable. And if you try to do that when you're not the owner, you're going to get a problem. So let's make a float for total stamina deducted. I'm going to call mine stamina deducted, initialized at 0. Next, you want to do a switch statement for an attack type, but we don't have that here yet, so let's make that variable. Let's make a variable for public attack type, and we can call that current attack type, or whatever you want to call it, as long as you know what it does. I'm going to call mine current attack type because I also have the current weapon being used. And now, let's go back to the play target action animation, and we're going to assign the current attack type to whatever the attack type is at the time you're playing an animation. So we call this play target attack animation when we're using a light attack. I'm just going to put this on the character combat manager base class because this will be used by everybody pretty universally. So over here we can say character combat manager, and we don't have that yet, so let's go and make that variable on the character manager. I guess we never made one. And while I'm doing that, it's the same process as before. I'm just going to talk about the attack type some more. So we're basically passing the attack type when we call the light attack action. Then it goes to the play target attack animation function, and then from there we set that attack type on our character combat manager, and from there we can actually drain some stamina, and we can choose how much we're draining using that attack type with the current weapon that we're using. So we're going to say character combat manager, and it's still giving me an error, so I guess I probably spelled it wrong. Let's see. Yes, I did. I'm going to fix that right now, though, because that's going to drive me nuts. So character manager, rename, character combat manager. There we go. So then we can just pass it here by saying character combat manager attack type equals attack type. And there we go. Let's save that. And now we can use the switch statement, even though we only have one attack right now. But in the future, you're going to have several, quite a few, most likely, depending on the scale of your project, of course. So right below here, switch current attack type, and we can access that, remember, because it's on a base class, and we are on the parent class. So if I go back here, here it is, public attack type, character combat manager, and we're on the player combat manager, so we get access to that as well. Now, before we move on, we have to check to see if the current weapon is null. It should never be null, but let's run a check just in case, otherwise you will get an error. So we're going to say if current weapon being used is null, just return. Now, under here in our switch statement with our one case, all we need to do is go to the case for light attack 01, and we just basically need to say stamina deducted is equal to current weapon being used dot base stamina cost times current weapon being used, and then we're going to use the light attack stamina modifier. And if you had a heavy attack, you would make one for the heavy attack stamina modifier and multiply it by that, and that's it. So finally, down at the bottom, we're going to actually deduct the stamina from our current stamina on the network manager by saying player.playerNetworkManager.current stamina.value, and then we would just say minus equals stamina deducted. And this is what we run a check for is owner, because this is the variable we're modifying here. And since this is going to be on an animation event, this function will be ran by everybody universally when the animation is fired. So how do we place this on the animation? Well, I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with animation events, and if not, this is how we're going to do it. You want to go to your animation file. Mine is an FBX, so I'm just going to click this here, unlock the inspector so I can see it. It's going to take me to this animation. I'm going to click on the FBX, and then I'm going to go down to events here. I'm going to place this where I want it. Now, if you have an animation file, it works very similar. You just need to access the animation events in a bit of a different way. But if you have an FBX, just go down here to events, find where you want to put it, hit this little plus icon over here, and then just basically paste the function name and apply. Now, when the animation gets to that specific frame, you're going to drain stamina. And as you can see there, it works. Cool, so that is working as intended. Now, how do we deal damage using this collider? We're going to open the collider using the same kind of concept here, using an animation event, but we need to do some things before we do that. We need to set the damage based on the attack type, for example, and we need a way to reliably open and close the collider. So in order to do that, first, let's go to the player equipment manager. Let's make a comment here for damage colliders, and I'm going to make two functions here, one for opening the damage collider and one for closing the damage collider. So how are we going to know which function, or which collider rather, to open our left or right hand? Well, we keep track of that already, so we can say if the player.playerNetworkManager is using right hand .value, then we know we want to open the right hand damage collider. Else if we're using the left hand, we want to open the left hand damage collider. Now in the future, when we add dual wielding or power stancing, it's going to work a little bit differently because we're going to open both colliders in the same animation at different times. But don't worry about that for now, because that's not important. With regular attacks, you're simply going to decide which hand you're using and open the respective colliders. So I'm going to make a comment here, open right weapon damage collider. And I'm going to make a comment below this, open left weapon damage collider. Now, we can do this by accessing the weapon manager that we made. I'm going to make another comment down here for the future, play whoosh sound effects. So this is a good time to play any sound effect of the weapon actually making that noise like it's cut into the air, because right when you open the damage collider, that's usually when you're going to start the descent of the weapon. So let's go to the weapon manager script and open that up. Let's make the melee damage collider public. And let's go back to the player equipment manager, and we can say right weapon manager dot melee damage collider. And we can say, I think I called it either open, no, enable damage collider most likely. Yes, enable damage collider. And then down here, do the same thing, copy and paste it, but change right to left because this is the left weapon. And now you can copy this function in its entirety and just change open to close. And this is how we're going to close the damage colliders. So I'm just going to call this close, delete the comment here, enable will be disable. And again, down here, enable will be disable. Okay, so now if we insert these events on some animations, this would open and close the damage collider, but we're still not done because we need to modify damage based on attack types, and we also need to damage other targets via the network. So first let's go and add these events. Let's go to our light attack and just find a place here where you want the damage to start. So the first point in your animation where you will be able to damage a character should be where you open it, and the last point is where you close it. I'm not going to think too much about this now, because this kind of comes down to how you want the game to feel. It's a good idea to place your drain stamina rather close to it, because you don't want to drain stamina if you don't actually get the attack off, if the attack gets interrupted by, say, taking damage. So then I'm just going to put close damage collider a little while after it and click apply. Good to go. Now let's go over to our melee weapon damage collider, and we need some more information here. So we can actually use a couple more variables. I'm going to call this weapon attack modifiers. And we only have one for now, actually, so let's just put down public float light attack 01 modifier. Now, we need to find where we set up our damage collider. That's already done in a nice, neat way in the weapon manager. And all we need to do, very simply, is say melee damage collider dot light attack 01 modifier equals weapon dot light attack 01 modifier. That's it. So this is already just going to handle the setup for us. And now, where we calculate our damage, we need to change that a little bit. So let's go down here, and first let's make an awake. And let's not actually make an awake here. Let's override an awake. So let's go to the damage collider base class and make an awake over here. And then we can just simply override that. So I'm going to make a protected virtual void awake. And then I'm going to go back to the melee weapon damage collider and override that awake method, just in case we want to add universal logic in the future that will apply to all damage colliders. So I'm going to say damage collider.enabled is equal to false. Why am I doing this? Well, you don't want to enable a melee weapon damage collider on startup because it's only enabled during specific frames of the attack. If you have it enabled on start, when you run into somebody just holding your weapon, it's going to hurt them. And you don't want that. I mean, maybe you do. If you do want that, you can do that here. All right, I'm going to save that. And the next thing we need to do is modify how we deal damage on trigger enter. So let's go to on trigger enter, and let's make it a protected virtual void so we can override it instead of a private void. Now, for now, we can copy all the logic there and just add some of our own, because it's going to be changed quite a bit. We're going to keep coming back to this and doing different iterations as we add blocking, for example, and the ability to parry. So nothing here is final right now. Now, the first thing we want to do, since we don't have our friendly fire system, is make sure we're not damaging ourselves. So we can say if damage target is equal to the character causing damage, simply return. You're going to want to check for this after the damage target is not null. Otherwise, you might get an error if it is null because there's nothing to check against. There we go. Save that. I'm going to make a comment here. We do not want to damage ourselves. Okay, so what's next? We need to go to the damage target function here and override that because we're changing some things again. So I don't think that's a virtual function. Oh, yes it is. Okay, so we can't override it. So I'm just going to copy every bit of logic from the base function and paste it here. Over here, damage target, and we can kind of pick and choose what we need to keep. And I think we keep all of this, but we do a whole lot more to it. And we don't process the instant effect. That's not what we do now because we need to make it a network thing. So let's just comment that out for now. Now, what do we do? Let's make another function here to modify the damage of this damage effect before we send it off to be processed. So I'm going to call this private void apply attack damage modifiers. And let's make it require a float for the modifier in question and a take damage effect to be modified. So basically, it starts off pretty normal. You just make your take damage effect, but then we're going to modify the values on that effect based on the modifiers of the current attack. So we're going to say damage.physical damage times equals modifier. And then do that for all of your damage types and your poise damage and basically anything you want to change based on the attack modifier. For example, in the future, weapons will do stamina damage to a person who's blocking. You might want to multiply your stamina damage by the modifier. You certainly would actually if you want heavy attacks to be more impactful. But for now, all we have is our damage types and our poise damage, so let's modify all that by the modifier, and I'm just going to check real quick. I think that's all we have right now on this. Yes, it is. I can't see any of the variables worth modifying, so that's good. And now we're going to do a comment here for the future logic. If the attack is fully charged, after the modification of, say, the heavy attack, you modify it again by another modifier. If you want to, for example, heavy attacks that are fully charged do ×2 damage, then you would modify that by ×2. But that is for the future when we do charging attacks. It's always nice to have the comments there, though, so you know what to come back to and what to do. All right, let's call this apply attack damage modifiers. We're going to use a switch statement again, though, for our one case, but in the future we'll have more. So what are we going to switch? We're going to switch the character causing damage and then the attack type through the character combat manager. That's not going to autocomplete, so I'm just going to retype that real quick. Okay, there we go. So the current attack type, and if the current attack type is a light attack 01, well, we're going to call apply attack damage modifiers, and we're going to pass the light attack 01 modifier, and we're going to pass always the damage effect that we just made, so that will just be damage effect. And now after we've ran it through the modifiers, we need to process it across the network. So this is the modifier we're using, light attack 01, and this is the damage effect we're using. So you can see here it's just the same as before, but we're just changing it. That's it. So we're just adding another layer of logic onto it. All right, so lastly, we want to check if the character causing damage is the owner, then we do this. Then we're going to send a damage request across the network. Now, let's talk for a second. Why am I only doing this if I am the owner? Well, let's think about this. Every time you play an attack animation, it's going to call that animation event, which is going to open a damage collider. Now, we don't want to call the damage twice. So to put it simply, when a damage collider collides with another character, we should only send a damage request if we are the one who owns the attacking character. My attacking character on your end should not send a request. It should only send a request from my end. That way we only send one damage request. There's also another pro of only doing this on the owner's end is you only got to keep track of your damage values on your end. So basically what I'm trying to say is that you don't need to know the physical damage on my damage collider. Only I need to know that because I'm the one sending this damage request. Hope that makes sense. So this is how we're going to handle it, and you're free to handle it any way that you want to, but I'm going to make it so that you can only send a damage request from your end if you're the owner, meaning if my game model on your screen hits you, nothing is going to happen on your end. Logic will only execute on my end, on one of the game objects, not both of them at the same time. Because again, you have to remember, for every client that I'm connected to, I have a game object in their game. I only want to fire this function one time, so I'm only doing it from my point of view on my end. Likewise, when we're actually deciding how much damage we take, we only want to decide that locally, meaning you don't have to know what my defense values are, only I do. This saves us from having to sync a lot of unnecessary variables. So to articulate another example, when you damage me and send a request to the server then sends that to me. And then on my end locally, I will tally up how much defense I have, and then I will print out the final damage and subtract it from my HP, which is then visible to everybody. This makes it so that you don't have to know my defense values, only I do. Again, you can choose to do this any way you want. This is just the way that I chose. This is the way I handle for Nephilim. And this is very just cost effective because you don't have to keep track of everything. If you're a person who wants to keep track of everything and you want everybody's character to know everybody else's information for whatever reason, and you want to pursue this in a different method, by all means, feel free to do so. Okay, so I'm going to go to the character network manager. I'm going to make a server RPC. I'm going to make a client RPC, and I'm going to make a function to be ran. I'm also going to delete these old comments here that repeat, and I'm going to make two new comments. I'll call one damage, and the other one attack animations, just so I can kind of quickly see what everything is. So I'm quickly just going through this script. So I'm going to start by saying server RPC, and then I'm going to make a public void. I'm going to call this notify the server of character damage or something along those lines. As long as you know that this function is called when you want to damage a character in the game. Now, what do we need? Well, we need quite a few variables for this, and we also need to make it so we can require ownership is false. Because when I damage you, I'm going to get your game object to play this server RPC from my end. So we're going to require a damaged character ID. And this is the person who's actually receiving the damage. And then we're going to require all of our damage types, so float, physical damage, and let me check here in what order they're in. You want to keep these in the same order if you can, just so it never gets confusing. So physical, magic, fire, holy, and poise. Okay, so physical, magic, and a float for fire, and then a float for holy damage, and then for poise damage. Cool. What else do we need? Well, we need the angle that we're hit from, which we don't use yet, but we're going to probably get into the next video when we start adding proper damage animations. And then we also need the contact point for X, Y, and Z, which we're going to use in the next video when we add the blood particle effects on contact. And then we need the character causing the damage. Now, character causing a damage is going to be the same thing as the damaged character. We're going to need a network object ID, which is just an oolong. And I'm actually going to move this variable right up to the top next to the damaged character, just because that makes the most sense to me. Now that we have all of this, let's copy all of these variables in their entirety, and let's paste them several times because we're going to use these for the client RPC. So we can actually just copy the entire function and just rename it. Instead of having server RPC require ownership, erase the required ownership and just call this a client RPC. And we can just change the name to notify the server of character damage client RPC. And I'll be right back. I have to fix these variables because they're half off the screen and that bothers me. Okay, we're good. So we can copy this again in its entirety and we can paste this. Now this is not going to be a server RPC or a client RPC, but rather the normal function. So we can just call this process character damage from server. And I am, again, going to fix these variables because they're half off the screen and that bothers me. There we go. Okay, so what do we need to do? We're going to check on the server RPC if we're the server, because you can't run a client RPC unless you are the server. So if we are the server, then we're going to run the notify the server of character damage client RPC and pass all of our variables. I'm just tabbing them in. Let's see if this auto-corrected correctly, or auto-filled correctly rather. Yes, sometimes it doesn't. All right, now down here in the client RPC, again, this is going to be ran for every single connected client. We're going to perform the character damage from server. So why do we run this on a client RPC where it runs for everybody, is what some of you are probably thinking. Well, there's not just damage happening here or animations, but rather in the future we're going to have particle effects and some other things as well. So it's nice to get this to run for everybody so you can see those effects. And if you remembered, we have a safeguard in our take damage effect where if any actions happen in there, that should only be ran by the owner. We're checking for if is owners, so we can safely process an effect and nothing bad should happen in theory. Okay, so let's put in all of our contact points and we're good to go. And now down here is where we actually start filling in the logic. And we just make this like we would a normal take damage effect. But first we need to get our characters in question. So let's make a character manager variable for the damaged character. Let's say that's equal to the network manager.singleton.spawn manager.spawn objects, and then we pass our damaged character ID, and then we game object.get component character manager. Why is this giving me grief? Oh, it's because I have the same name as a local variable. I'll fix that in a second. And then we need a character manager for the character causing damage. So we do this the same way. We fetch it from the network manager and we use the spawn manager. So I could just rename this the damage character manager, but honestly, I really don't like that. So instead, we're going to rename these variables damaged character ID and character causing damage ID, because that makes more sense to me. So I'm just going to quickly rename these and skip this part of the video and cut it. And then we come back, we can go back to writing this function. So again, we're fetching these two character variables from the network spawn manager, just using their network ID. And this works if the character manager is on the same game object as the network object script. And if you're doing it my way, it should be. If not, just make adjustments as needed. So we have a reference to our character causing damage and our damaged character. And we have all of the values here for our physical damage and our poise damage. So we just do the same thing we would normally do. We start by making a take damage effect variable, a damage effect. And then we're going to instantiate a copy of this effect from the world character effects manager.instance.take damage effect. And then from there, we just fill in the values and then we process the effect on the character in question. So we would say damage effect.physical damage is equal to physical damage, damage effect.magic damage is equal to magic damage, then the fire damage is equal to fire damage, etc., etc. So it's just the same throughout. Now, for the poison angle hit from, it's just the same thing, but for our contact point, we just need to simply say damage effect dot contact point is equal to a new vector 3, and then we pass our contact point x, y, and z, and that's it. We end off by saying the damaged character dot character effects manager dot process instant effect, and then we pass our damage effect. So again, since this is being processed for everybody in the game, then the damaged character, their game object, and everybody else's game will process the effects. When we add blood effects, it should pop up for everybody in the correct place. And only they can edit their health, so that will be done on their end, and then that will be synced for everybody else on the network because it is a network variable. All right, so let's save that. And now just before we go on, I'm just going to show you what I mean too about it being all right. So if we go to the take damage effect, you can see here we have a lot of stuff happening, but under calculate damage, right here, we're only running the logic if we are the owner, but everything else on this script will run. So in the future, when we add play damage VFX and play damage sound effects, they will run. All right, so now we can go over into the game, and if you start, I have an error. If I double click this, it's actually taking me to the wrong place. There's no error on this line. Don't know why Visual Studio is doing that. But if I go to the melee weapon damage collider, the error that I have is that we're trying to disable a damage collider that does not exist. So what we want to do is go to the damage collider script and make the damage collider a serializable field or initialize it somehow. So you have two choices here. You can call it an awake, or you can make it a serializable variable and drag it in the inspector. I'm just going to go through both. So let's make this a serializable field and then save that, and then it will become visible in the inspector. Go down to your damage collider and drag in the collider variable. Now what you can do too is just have a failsafe, and you can check if that collider is null. I'm just going to drag it in the unarmed weapon because that's going to give us an error also. But you can check if the collider is null, and if it is null, then you can try to get it by using get component. So that makes it so if for some reason you forget to drag it in, then it's just going to try to get one on the same game object. So again, entirely up to you. However you want to organize the structure of your game objects is going to determine what way you choose to go about this. So I'm going to save that now, and now we should be good to go. But we actually have to call the server RPC, or else we can't damage our character. So we're going to say if character causing damage is owner, then we're going to say damage target dot character network manager dot notify server of damage, and then we pass all of our variables. Remember, we're calling this on the damage target, not the character causing damage. And because we don't require ownership on the server RPC, we can request this server RPC from our character by activating it on the character we're damaging. So just put in all your variables here and make sure you don't mix up the network object ID of the character being damaged and the character causing the damage. Otherwise, you're going to have the damage effect play on the person who's actually swinging the weapon. So after you put in all of your variables here, again, you might want to check and make sure you're doing them all in the right order. That's why I like to keep things in the same order everywhere. So for example, if I ever have all of the damage variables laid out somewhere, even in the UI, I always keep them in the same order that I made them on the weapon. That way you just kind of get used to typing them in that order, and you don't accidentally put in the fire damage in place where the physical damage would be. So yeah, just fill in all your variables, make sure they are in the correct place. If you want to reference your contact point here, you want to say X, Y, and Z. Again, make sure you're doing that in the proper order, or else you're going to get some weird behavior and you get stuff instantiating in the wrong place in the future. Okay, so when that's good, you can save that. Let's jump into the game. I'm going to swing. You can't see it, but I've just dealt some damage to this character. And if I swing again at this character, that should be the entirety of their health and they should die, and yes, they do. So now if I drag over the client here, you can see that there's been a damage effect, or the final damage is 130 two times. So let's check our sword here and do some math. If we bring up the physical damage, it's 118. And then the light attack damage modifier is 1.1. So if we say 118 times 1.1, yes, it's about 130 damage if you round up. Cool, so that's working as intended. Now let's check our stamina drain and see if that ends up being the same thing. So we can't see that variable here for some reason on the network manager, so I'm just going to quickly make a debug log and just print out the stamina that we're actually expending when we do an attack to make sure this works properly. So that is over on the player combat manager, right at the bottom here, debug.log stamina drained or stamina deducted is probably a better thing to say. And then we pass the total stamina deducted. And it's always good to check stuff like this just to make sure it works. You should especially test things that have to do with trading around a lot of numbers, because you could accidentally insert something in the wrong place and then it doesn't work as intended and you might not even notice it. So I'm going to swing the sword here now, and we have 22 stamina deducted. See, that doesn't sound right. So we have 20 as a base times 0.9 as a modifier. Yeah, that should not be 22, that should be like 18. Yes, so I'm using the attack modifier on accident. I should be using the light attack stamina cost multiplier. See, that's one of those mistakes I am referencing. So save that, go back into the game, and I swing, and yes, it is 18, and I'm just going to check my math on a calculator to be sure. 20 times 0.9 is equal to 18. So yeah, that is working as intended. Excellent. So what are we going to do on the next video? We're going to make it so when you're struck, you play a damage animation, as well as a blood particle effect, as well as a sound effect, and then we're going to add sound effects like whooshing noises to our weapon when we swing them, and we can give each weapon their own set of noises. So we're just going to basically polish up what we have done here now and expand upon it further. And the episode after that, we're going to add combo attacks. Alright guys, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you all have a lovely weekend, and I will see you all next week.